The classroom buzzed with the low murmur of students settling into their seats, notebooks opening, laptops clicking awake. Morning sun filtered weakly through the tall windows, casting long beams across the old wooden desks. At the front of the room stood Professor Alden, his posture slightly stooped, his hands clasped behind his back. His gray hair was thin, his glasses thick, and though he smiled warmly at the class, there was a subtle tremor in his fingers. It was his first day back after a long medical leave, one the students knew only as memory complications. Some whispered that he was too old to be teaching. Others said he was a legend, someone who had shaped the department for decades. But all eyes were on him, waiting to see if he could still command a room. All eyes except one. In the third row, a young woman with electric blue hair leaned back in her chair, arms crossed tightly. Her gaze was sharp, skeptical, unyielding. Her expression said everything. He shouldn't be here. Her name was Mara, outspoken, fiery, convinced that outdated voices needed to be challenged. To her, Professor Alden represented the past, a symbol of institutional stubbornness she was determined to dismantle. As the professor greeted the class, Mara's eyes narrowed. "Good morning," he said, voice warm but fragile. "Thank you all for being here. I'm grateful to return." A few students clapped politely. Others offered small smiles. Mara didn't move. Professor Alden adjusted his glasses. "I know there were concerns," he continued softly, "but I promise you, I will do my best." Mara lifted her hand abruptly, not waiting to be acknowledged. The gesture was sharp enough to slice the room's gentle atmosphere. "Yes?" Professor Alden said kindly. She rose to her feet. "If you don't mind," she said loudly, "I'd like to ask a question, just to see if you're prepared." A few students exchanged uneasy looks. The professor hesitated. "Of course," he said, trying to smile. "Go ahead." Mara took a step forward, her tone coated with sweet venom. "You claim you're fit to teach again. So tell us, Professor, what year did the department hire you, and what was the title of your first published paper?" She folded her arms. "Should be easy, right? If your memory's working." A cold ripple passed through the classroom. Professor Alden blinked, caught off guard. His hand rose halfway to his glasses, then stopped. His gaze drifted to the windows, as though the answers were hiding somewhere in the morning light. Silence thickened. Mara smirked. "Well," she pressed, "or is that too much for you now?" A student in the back whispered, "Mara, stop." But she didn't. Professor Alden frowned slightly, struggling. His lips parted, but no sound came out. His brow tightened with effort, with frustration, with something that looked dangerously close to shame. Mara tilted her chin. "If you can't remember your own career, why are you teaching ours?" His hands trembled, and for the first time since he walked into the room, his smile disappeared. The class held its breath, unsure whether they were witnessing a challenge or a cruelty. Then suddenly, the professor inhaled sharply, as if something distant had snapped into place inside his mind. He lifted his eyes, and for the first time, there was clarity behind them. "Mara," he said quietly, his voice steadying. And the entire room leaned forward, sensing that something unexpected, something powerful, was about to unfold. The room fell into a tense stillness as Professor Alden straightened slowly, as if standing not just with his spine but with something deeper, something reclaimed. His trembling hands settled. His breathing steadied. The fog behind his eyes lifted with surprising force. Mara's smirk faltered. "The year was 1979, Professor Alden said, his voice low but unwavering. "I was hired in the fall semester. I still remember the smell of the chalk dust the day I unlocked my new office." Several students exchanged looks, impressed, surprised. Mara blinked, but her expression remained defiant. He continued, "And my first published paper." His eyes softened, drifting toward a spot in the back of the room as if seeing something far away but vivid. It was titled, "The Unseen Struggle: How Early Encouragement Shapes a Child's Mind." A few students murmured, recognizing the title from their readings. Professor Alden lowered his gaze back to Mara. "It took me 2 years to finish," he added, "because I couldn't stop thinking about the student who inspired it." This time, Mara's confidence wavered. The professor took a small breath. He was 9 years old, quiet, brilliant, but afraid of everything, especially himself. He thought he was worthless. The class grew still. "One day," Alden said, his voice softening, "he brought me a page of writing he had hidden in his backpack. He asked if I would read it. He said he needed someone to tell him if it was stupid." A muscle in Mara's jaw twitched. Professor Alden's throat tightened. "It wasn't stupid. It was extraordinary. I told him that. And that moment, just that small moment, changed his life. He grew up believing he could be something, someone." A hush fell over the students. The professor's eyes glistened with the faintest trace of emotion. "I spent that entire year wondering how many children carry brilliance inside them but never hear the words that could unlock it." He looked directly at Mara, and his gaze held no resentment, only depth. "That paper," he said, "wasn't about research. It was about responsibility. The responsibility teachers have to lift others, especially when they are weak." Mara swallowed, her posture faltering under the weight of his calm sincerity. Professor Alden's voice grew quieter. "So, when you ask me if I remember the title, I do. Not because my mind is perfect, but because my heart never forgot why I wrote it." The room felt suddenly smaller, as though everyone were leaning forward without meaning to. Even Mara's aggressive stance faded, her arms slowly uncrossed. "I may forget names," Professor Alden continued gently. "I may forget dates. I may forget where I left my keys or my glasses." A soft ripple of laughter passed through the class. "But the work I've done for my students, and the lives I've been privileged to witness, those memories don't fade." His gaze lingered on Mara, not accusing, not defensive, but piercing in its quiet truth. "You tested my memory," he said, "but you tested the wrong part of it." A stunned silence followed. Then, from the back of the room, a student whispered, "Damn." Mara's face flushed, but not with anger this time. Something deeper, something shaken. And for the first time since class began, she had no words. Professor Alden adjusted his glasses with steady hands. "Now," he said softly, "may I continue teaching?" A wave of emotion surged through the room, and the entire class, every single student, rose silently to their feet. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The room stood frozen, a fragile moment suspended between shock and awakening. Then the sound of chairs scraping back filled the air as more students rose to their feet, one by one, until the entire class stood in a unified silence facing Professor Alden. Mara remained seated, her breath hitched as she watched everyone rise around her. Students who, moments earlier, had seemed indifferent, now standing tall, eyes fixed on the old man with a respect so palpable it filled the room like a warm tide. A student near the front cleared his throat. "Professor," he said softly, "we're glad you're back." Another spoke up from the window row. "We missed you, sir." Professor Alden blinked rapidly, taken aback by the sudden show of loyalty. His hand instinctively moved to his chest as if trying to steady the emotion swelling there. "Oh," he whispered, voice trembling. Thank you." He hadn't expected applause or admiration. He had barely expected to remember his own words. But seeing the entire class standing before him, eyes soft with gratitude, was more than he had prepared for. But one person still hadn't stood. Mara. She stared at her desk, hands clasped tightly. The blue strands of her hair fell forward, concealing half her face. Her earlier confidence, the fire she had entered with, now felt strangely hollow. Professor Alden noticed. He addressed the class gently. "Thank you, truly, but please sit. We have much to learn today." But the students didn't sit. Instead, they turned, all of them, toward Mara. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. She felt their eyes, their disapproval, but also something else, expectation. They weren't asking her to bow or surrender. They were asking her to acknowledge what had just happened, to meet the moment, not hide from it. Her throat tightened. Slowly, painfully, she pushed back her chair and rose to her feet. Not because she was pressured, not because she feared judgment, but because something inside her, something she hadn't recognized in a long time, softened. Respect. She finally looked up at Professor Alden. Their eyes met. And in that moment, she realized something she hadn't understood until now. He did not stand against her. He stood above her, not with authority, but with humanity. Mara swallowed hard and forced her voice to work. "Professor Alden," she began, but the words caught in her throat. She exhaled shakily and tried again, softer this time. "I didn't know." The room waited. The professor nodded slowly, kindly. "Ignorance is never the problem," he said. "Only the refusal to learn." Her eyes burned. She felt exposed, humbled, and strangely relieved. Alden gestured gently for the class to sit. Chairs slid back as students obeyed, though their eyes never strayed far from him or her. When Mara finally sat, she did so slowly, cautiously, like someone stepping into unfamiliar emotional ground. The professor returned to the board, picking up a piece of chalk with steady hands. "Today," he said, "we begin with a lesson far more important than the one in your textbook." The chalk tapped softly against the board. Compassion. The word hung there like a lantern in the dim morning light. But Mara barely saw the chalk. Her focus was on the man who had just demonstrated a truth sharper than any theory she'd learned. Memory can falter. Names, dates, details, they fade. But purpose stays. And for the first time, Mara wondered if she actually knew less about justice and humanity than she thought. She opened her notebook with trembling hands. For once, not to challenge, but to learn. Professor Alden rested the chalk on the tray and turned back to the class with a composed, gentle smile. The word compassion on the board seemed to glow in the morning light, giving the silent room a strange sense of warmth. Students leaned forward, ready, not out of obligation, but out of genuine attention. But Mara shifted uncomfortably. Her earlier smugness was gone. What remained was a mix of embarrassment, confusion, and something she hadn't felt in a long time: humility. She tapped her pen against her notebook, not to provoke, but to ground herself. Professor Alden clasped his hands behind him. "Compassion," he began, "is not weakness, and it is not an excuse. It is clarity." His eyes swept the room, landing momentarily on Mara. "Clarity to see that every person carries a story you know nothing about." Mara's chest tightened. He wasn't attacking her. He wasn't even addressing her directly. But the words touched her like a hand placed softly on her shoulder. He continued, "Many people assume that age dulls a person, that it strips away purpose or relevance." He smiled a little. "It's true my memory sometimes betrays me. It's true I am slower now." He tapped his temple lightly. "But the wisdom I have gained did not fade with my speed." A ripple of agreement moved among the students. "And that," he said, "is why you are all here. Not to learn facts you can search for online, not to memorize dates, but to learn how to think, how to feel, how to lead with integrity." Mara closed her eyes for a moment, overwhelmed by the gentleness of his authority. "And sometimes," Alden added softly, "leadership means listening, especially when it feels uncomfortable." When she opened her eyes, he was looking at her, not accusing, not shaming, inviting. Mara's throat tightened. She looked down quickly, flipping a page in her notebook just to keep her hands busy. Professor Alden stepped toward the center of the room. "I want to share something else with you," he said. "Something personal." The students straightened. Alden took a slow breath. "During my leave, I was terrified I'd never be able to come back. My doctors prepared me for that possibility." He paused. "And truthfully, so did I. I thought my usefulness had ended." A murmur swept through the classroom, soft, sympathetic. "But then," he continued, "I remembered why I became a teacher in the first place." His gaze softened, distant. "Because one day, long ago, Someone believed in me when they had no reason to. And I promised myself I would spend my life giving that gift to others. His voice trembled, but not with weakness, with purpose. I returned, he said, because even if my mind falters, my heart still knows how to teach. The room was silent again, the kind of silence that belongs only to moments that matter. Then, unexpectedly, Mara raised her hand. Her movements were slow, hesitant, nothing like the sharp, aggressive gesture she had made earlier. Professor Alden nodded gently toward her. "Yes, Mara?" She stood, not out of pride this time, but out of respect. Even her blue hair seemed softer in the warm classroom light. When she spoke, her voice lacked its usual fire. "Sir," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Several students turned toward her, eyebrows raised. Mara took a shaky breath. "I thought I understood everything. I thought I was defending something important, but I didn't see you. I didn't see the person behind the professor." Her voice cracked. "I was wrong." The words hung trembling in the air. Professor Alden didn't smile triumphantly. He didn't nod sternly. He simply looked at her with the gentle grace of someone who had spent a lifetime teaching more than just lessons. "Thank you," he said softly. "Acknowledging our mistakes is one of the hardest things any of us can do." He paused. "And one of the bravest." Mara exhaled shakily, her shoulders dropping. "But," Alden added with a hint of warmth, "if you truly want to understand me better, perhaps you should hear how I remember my students. Not through dates or grades, but through the light they carry." Mara slowly sat, her face flushed, but her heart open for the first time. Professor Alden walked back to the chalkboard, erasing the word compassion, only to replace it with two more: humanity, remembrance. The class leaned in, captivated. Mara felt a lump in her throat. She thought she had come to college to challenge the world. But today, the world had challenged her, through a man she had underestimated, a man who would soon share a memory so powerful, so unexpected, it would shake the entire room to its core. Professor Alden stepped away from the board, the words humanity and remembrance standing bold behind him like silent companions. He folded his hands, inhaling slowly, the kind of breath taken before diving into something deep, fragile, and rarely spoken aloud. The class leaned forward. Even Mara, usually sharp and defensive, sat with her hands clasped tight, her blue hair falling softly around her face as she waited. "This memory," Alden began, "isn't about a theory or a lesson plan. It's about a moment that shaped everything I became." His voice softened. "I was 28, a new teacher, nervous, uncertain, trying far too hard to seem wiser than I was." A few students smiled gently. "In my first semester," he continued, "I had a student, a quiet boy, always sat in the back. Clothes never fit quite right, shoulders always hunched as if hiding from the world." Alden paused. "His name was Theo." The class held its breath. Theo, a single name heavy with story. "He struggled," Alden said softly. "Not with learning. He was brilliant, but with life. Life had dealt him a cruel hand." Alden's eyes drifted to the window, seeing something no one else could. His parents fought constantly. Money was scarce. He often came to school hungry, and he had been told by many that he wasn't going to amount to anything. Mara winced. One student whispered, "That's awful." "Yes," Alden nodded. "Awful. And familiar to far too many children." He swallowed, his voice tightening. One day, he didn't come to class. Or the next, or the next. A week passed. I visited his home, something teachers rarely did at that time. The room tensed. "I found him on the front steps," he continued quietly. "Small, shaking, crying. He said he wanted to disappear, that the world had no space for him, that he didn't matter." Mara brought a hand to her mouth. Alden's next words cracked slightly. "I sat beside him for hours, not teaching, not correcting, just listening." He blinked back, something sharp in his eyes. "And at the end of our conversation, I told him something I wasn't even sure was true yet. I promise you, Theo, you matter to me. A hush fell over the classroom, thick, emotional. And from that day, Alden said softly, he began to rise, slowly, painfully. But he rose. Mara stared at him, eyes glistening. Years later, Alden continued with a trembling smile. Theo sent me a letter. He had finished college. He had become a teacher himself. Alden paused, voice breaking. He wrote, "You saved my life when you didn't even know you were saving it." The class exhaled all at once, a collective emotional release. But Alden wasn't done. He cleared his throat, voice lowering. During my medical leave, when my memory failed me most, when I feared I had nothing left to give, he placed a hand gently on his chest. Theo visited me. Gasps rose around the room. He told me, "You don't need your memory to inspire anyone. You just need your heart." And that has never changed. Alden's voice cracked fully now, a tear slipping down his cheek. He said he became the teacher he is today because of me, and that countless children carry a piece of my kindness without ever knowing my name. The class was silent, not stunned, not speechless, but moved in a way classrooms rarely experience. Mara wiped her cheeks quickly, trying to hide how deeply the story pierced her. Alden looked around the room with softened eyes. "So, when you tested my memory," he looked toward Mara, not reproachfully, but with immeasurable gentleness, "you didn't test the part of me that truly matters." Mara bowed her head, unable to meet his gaze. "And when I stand here now," Alden continued, "I don't stand as a perfect mind. I stand as a teacher who still, even now, believes in young people more than they believe in themselves." A heavy silence followed. Then something remarkable happened. A student in the front row, a quiet girl who rarely spoke, whispered, almost reverently, "Thank you." Mara looked up, tears clinging to her lashes. More voices followed. "Thank you, Professor. Thank you. Thank you, sir." Alden's breath trembled as he closed his eyes for a moment, overwhelmed by the sincerity in the room. Mara pressed a hand to her heart, fragile, humbled, broken open. She had mocked him. She had underestimated him. She had tried to expose his weakness, and instead, he had revealed her own. No one moved. No one spoke. They simply waited, knowing the moment wasn't finished yet. Because Mara, shaken to her core, was about to say something that would change everything. The classroom felt transformed. No longer just desks and fluorescent lights, but a space suspended between emotion and awakening. Professor Alden stood quietly beside the board, his hands folded in front of him, his eyes still moist. He wasn't asking for pity. He wasn't seeking praise. He was simply there, whole in his vulnerability, powerful in his honesty. And Mara could barely breathe. Her chest rose and fell in uneven rhythms as she stared at the professor, her earlier arrogance shattered into pieces she didn't know how to pick up. Her fingers trembled against her notebook. For the first time in years, she felt like a student, not a warrior, not a fighter, not a challenger of systems, just a human being sitting in front of a truth she hadn't expected. Professor Alden turned slightly, addressing the class again with gentle composure. "Now, I'd like us to begin today's lesson." But no one moved, because all eyes were on Mara, who stood suddenly, abruptly, her chair scraping loudly across the floor. The sound cut through the silence like a blade. Dozens of heads swiveled toward her. She felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she didn't sit back down. Not this time, not after what she had just witnessed. Her throat felt tight as she tried to speak. "Professor." She cleared her throat again. "Professor Alden, I need to say something." He nodded patiently. "Of course, Mara." She inhaled sharply. The words felt stuck, tangled, heavy, but she forced them forward. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Truly, I didn't just test your memory. I tried to humiliate you." Her voice wavered. "I thought your weakness made you less capable. I thought your age meant irrelevance. But you She swallowed, eyes burning. You showed me more strength in 10 minutes than I've shown in years. A hush slid over the room. Mara continued, voice trembling with something raw and unpolished. I came in here ready to fight you, not learn from you. Her gaze lifted slowly, meeting his. But you taught me something today, not from the textbook, not from theory, but from your life. Professor Alden's expression softened. Mara blinked quickly, trying to hold herself together. You reminded me that teaching isn't about being perfect. It's about being human. Her voice broke. And I forgot that. A few students murmured their agreement. She took another breath, shaky, vulnerable. I judged you before I listened to you, and listening. She gestured toward the board. Maybe that's what compassion actually is. Professor Alden smiled, a small, deeply warm smile that erased any trace of bitterness. Thank you, Mara. But she wasn't done. She stepped forward, voice steadier now. Professor, could you tell us more about Theo? About the other students you've helped? Her tone held genuine curiosity, not challenge. I have a lot to learn from the way you see the world. The room seemed to brighten, even though the lights hadn't changed. Alden chuckled softly, the sound low and touched by emotion. I would be honored, he said. Mara let out a breath she'd been holding for what felt like years and slowly lowered herself back into her seat. Her classmates glanced at her with newfound respect, not for her loudness, but for her humility. Professor Alden stepped toward the front of the room again, his footsteps slow but sure. Before I continue, he said, I want to tell you something important. The class waited. He looked at Mara, not challenging her, but lifting her. Growth, he said gently, doesn't come from being right. It comes from being brave enough to let go of certainty. Mara's eyes shimmered. He turned back to the class. Now, he said softly, let me tell you about a moment in my life that taught me that same lesson, long before I ever met Theo. The students leaned forward again, captivated, and Mara, humbled, transformed, eyes wide open, picked up her pen for the first time that morning, ready at last to learn. Professor Alden rested one hand on the desk as he gathered himself. The classroom quieted again, not out of politeness, but out of a reverence rarely found in academic spaces. Students leaned forward, notebooks forgotten. Even the hallway noise outside seemed to fade. This next memory, he said slowly, is one I've rarely spoken about, not because it's painful, but because it taught me the value of silence, humility, and truly seeing another person. Mara straightened in her chair, her blue hair falling behind her shoulders as she leaned in. Her eyes, once sharp with judgment, now carried something entirely different. Anticipation, respect, and something that looked very close to remorse. Professor Alden continued, before I ever taught in a university, I worked as an assistant at a community center. We tutored children, helped adults earn literacy certificates, anything that strengthened the neighborhood. One evening, a man came in, disheveled, exhausted, angry at the world. He paused, remembering. He slammed a book on the table and said, "Teach me how to read or don't. I don't care anymore." A ripple of sympathy swept the room. I asked him to sit, Alden said. But he wouldn't. He started pacing. He told me he felt invisible, useless, unworthy of the simplest things. And then, he said he hated teachers. Said they'd made him feel stupid his entire life. Mara flinched slightly. Professor Alden's voice softened. I didn't argue with him. I didn't defend teachers or myself. I simply asked him, if you hate teachers, why did you come here today? The class leaned in. He stopped pacing, Alden continued, and he said, because I want to read a letter my daughter wrote before she died. And I can't. A pin drop could have echoed. Mara pressed a hand over her heart, tears threatening again. Alden went on, voice steady but soaked in memory. He carried that letter folded in his pocket for months, waiting for the courage to understand his child's words. That night, He placed it into my hands and said, "Read it to me. I need to hear her one more time." His voice cracked. I read it to him, slowly, gently, word by word. Alden swallowed, and he cried like the world had ended, because in a way, it had. The professor let out a controlled breath. He came every night after that, not to fight the world, not to prove anything, just to read her letter himself. Alden smiled sadly. And one night, he did. The class remained breathlessly silent. And when he finished, Alden added softly, he hugged me tightly and whispered, "Thank you for giving my daughter back to me." Mara covered her mouth as tears streamed down her cheeks. That night, Alden continued, I understood something I had never realized before, that teaching is not about intelligence or authority or being beyond reproach. Teaching, he said, looking at each student slowly, is about love. A love so persistent that it searches for the small hidden pieces inside each person and brings them to the surface. His eyes returned to Mara. "That man didn't test my memory," Alden said kindly. "He tested my compassion, and I have spent my entire career trying to honor that moment." Mara's tears fell openly now. Around her, several classmates sniffled, wiping their eyes. Professor Alden stepped back, almost shy under the intensity of their gaze. "I'm not telling you this for praise," he said. "I'm telling you this because the world needs fewer people asking, 'What can you prove?' and more people asking, 'How can I understand you better?'" Mara stood again, slowly this time. "Professor," she whispered, voice trembling, I don't know what to say. I feel like you're teaching me more about life than any book ever has." Alden smiled warmly. "Books teach us knowledge. People teach us meaning." She wiped her cheeks. "And I'm so sorry I didn't see that sooner." He nodded. "You see it now, and that is enough." The room sat in silence, holding the weight of the story like a delicate glass sphere. Finally, Professor Alden inhaled deeply. "Shall we continue?" he asked softly. But as he stepped toward the board, his hand faltered, just slightly. A subtle tremor, a brief sway of his balance. Mara shot to her feet. "Professor," he steadied himself on the desk, offering a fragile smile. "I'm all right. Just tired." But Mara wasn't convinced, and neither was the class, because something was happening to him, something none of them were ready for. Professor Alden kept one hand on the desk, his knuckles whitening slightly as he steadied himself. His fragile smile tried to reassure the class, but the tremor in his arm betrayed him. The students shifted uneasily. The air changed, from reverent silence to protective tension. "Sir, please sit," one student urged softly. Alden shook his head, embarrassed. No, I'm fine. I just stood too quickly." He attempted a light laugh, but it dissolved into a shallow breath that didn't quite fill his lungs. Mara stepped forward, fear tightening her features. "Professor, please, you don't need to push yourself." Alden raised a gentle hand. "Mara, I appreciate your concern, but I've been teaching for over 40 years. I won't collapse from telling a story." But then his vision flickered, just for a second. The room tilted. He blinked rapidly, gripping the table harder. Forgive me. Just a moment." The class collectively rose halfway from their seats. "Professor?" a student near the window said. "Are you sure?" But Alden lifted his chin and gave them the same proud smile he'd worn for decades of teaching. "Let an old man have his dignity," he murmured. Yet his knees wavered. Mara's breath caught. "Sir, please sit down. It's not about dignity. It's about you." Her voice cracked, the sharpness gone, replaced with an urgency she herself wasn't used to feeling. Alden hesitated, caught between pride and physical need. Then his hand slipped slightly. It was subtle, a half-inch, maybe less, but enough. Mara rushed forward, catching his other arm before he could sway again. "Professor, please, let us help you." A hush fell over the room. Alden looked at her, really looked, and saw not confrontation or defiance, but fear and care. Genuine care. His expression softened. "All right," he whispered. "Just for a moment." Two students quickly pulled a chair from the front row. Mara guided him gently into it, her hands trembling. He lowered himself slowly and exhaled deeply, as if surrendering a weight he'd been carrying alone. "Thank you," he murmured, voice thin now. "These spells, they come and go." Mara knelt beside him. "Have you talked to your doctors about this?" He nodded wearily. "Yes. They say it's part of the condition. Stress, emotion, fatigue. It can trigger moments like this." Emotion flickered across the classroom. Alden looked up with a faint smile. "But I assure you, I'm not dying in your lecture. That would be terribly inconvenient for grading purposes." Laughter broke through the tension, soft, shaky, but real. Mara squeezed his hand. "Professor, you don't have to pretend for us." He looked surprised. "Pretend? You're allowed to be cared for," she said, tears forming. "You've spent your whole life taking care of others." Alden inhaled shakily. His eyes glistened, and then it happened. One by one, students stood again, not in applause this time, but in solidarity, in protection, in gratitude. They formed a subtle wall around him, their bodies angled inward like a shield. One student spoke softly from behind Mara. "You've lifted so many people, Professor. Let us lift you." Alden pressed his lips together, emotion overwhelming him. He looked around the room slowly, seeing not faces now, but lives shaped, however slightly, by his kindness, his patience, his presence. "Thank you," he whispered, voice breaking. You don't know what this means." Mara brushed a tear from her cheek. "Actually, I think we do." Professor Alden closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing their warmth. When he opened them again, the fog had not entirely lifted, but the fear had. "You know," he said softly, "a teacher dreams of many things, but standing in a room where compassion becomes louder than challenge, that is a gift beyond anything I ever hoped for." No one spoke. The silence was full of respect, full of emotion, full of unspoken promises. Finally, Alden drew a steady breath. "If you'll allow me," he said, "there's one more memory I want to share. One last lesson before we end today." Mara leaned in, eyes soft. "Of course," she whispered. But no one knew, not even Alden himself, that what he was about to say would bring the entire class to their feet once more, in a moment far more powerful than the first. Professor Alden rested both hands on his knees, still catching his breath. The students remained gathered around him, forming a gentle protective circle. Mara stayed closest, watching him with a mixture of worry and reverence. He inhaled slowly, not to steady his body, but his heart. "There's something I've never told a class before," he began softly. "A memory that shaped the teacher I became, and the man I tried to be." The room hushed instantly. "Before I ever taught Theo, before the community center, before all of this," he gestured faintly at the chalkboard, the desks, the students, "I had a teacher of my own, a man named Mr. Hale." A few students frowned. They had never heard him mention this name. "He was old," Alden said with a tender smile. "Very old. Older than I am now." His hands shook, his voice cracked, and the younger teachers mocked him behind his back. They said he should have retired years before. Mara lowered her eyes, understanding the sting of those words now in a way she hadn't before. "But he stayed," Alden continued, "not out of stubbornness, but because he believed he had one more student left to reach." He paused, and that student was me. A ripple moved through the room. Alden's gaze drifted up as if the memory were floating on the ceiling. "I struggled when I was young. I was awkward, quiet. I doubted myself constantly. Many teachers overlooked me, but Mr. Hale, his voice softened to a whisper. He saw me. Every student leaned forward. He told me I had a mind worth developing, a heart worth trusting, a future worth fighting for. And when I told him I wasn't good enough to become a teacher, do you know what he said? Professor Alden looked at the class, eyes shining. He said, "Then let your compassion be greater than your fear, and the world will teach you the rest." A collective breath left the room. Mara covered her mouth as her chest tightened with emotion. Alden smiled sadly. He taught until the day he collapsed in front of his class. They said it was peaceful. He simply finished a sentence and sat down. Mara's eyes welled with tears. "Professor..." Alden looked at her gently. He died doing what he loved, giving hope to students who didn't know they could shine. The room felt charged with electricity, not loud but powerful in its stillness. "And now," Alden continued, voice growing steadier, "as I grow older, and my mind fails me at times, I finally understand him." He placed a hand on his chest. "I understand why he stayed." Mara's tears fell. "Because when you love teaching, truly love it, there is always one more student you hope to reach." A pause. Then Alden inhaled. "And today, that student was you, Mara." The words hit her like a gentle thunderbolt, not shaming, not condemning, but lifting her in a way she was utterly unprepared for. Mara broke. She cried openly, shoulders trembling, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "Professor, I don't deserve that." Alden shook his head softly. "Every student deserves to be seen. Everyone. Even those who challenge me. Especially those." Her voice came out in a whisper. "You reached me." Alden smiled, a warm, tired, grateful smile. And then, without instruction, without hesitation, the entire class rose to their feet again. Not just to honor him, not just to comfort him, but because they had just witnessed something sacred, a teacher giving his last greatest lesson, not from a textbook, but from his soul. Alden's breath caught as he looked around at the standing students, his eyes shimmering with disbelief. "My goodness," he whispered, "you honor me more than I ever deserved." But the moment wasn't over, because Mara took a step forward, her voice quiet but unwavering. "Professor Alden, what was it that really made you return to teach after your memory diagnosis?" The class fell silent, waiting. Alden looked at her, deeply, with a calm that felt almost luminous. And then he gave the answer that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. "I came back," he said softly, "because I wanted at least one more chance to become the teacher Mr. Hale believed I could be." Several students gasped. Mara pressed both hands to her face, sobbing. The room stood in reverent silence. And for the second time that day, the class rose to their feet not out of respect for an old man's memory, but out of awe for the size of his heart. The room stood silent, every student lifted to their feet as if pulled by an invisible thread. Professor Alden sat quietly in his chair, the steady rise and fall of his chest the only sign of movement. His eyes shimmered with a brightness that came not from strength but from meaning, the kind of meaning a lifetime of teaching can carve into a person's soul. Mara wiped her cheeks, still trembling, but something new had awakened behind her blue hair, behind her fierce posture, something gentler, humbler, and infinitely more powerful. Professor Alden looked around the room slowly, almost as if engraving their faces into whatever parts of his memory still remained. "Thank you," he whispered. "Truly, you have given me something today that I cannot and will not forget." A soft murmur rippled through the class, not noise, but emotion trying to find its way out. Mara stepped forward. "Professor, may I say something?" He nodded gently. "Of course, Mara." She swallowed hard, then lifted her gaze to meet his. "I came into this room ready to attack you, ready to expose you. I thought your age made you fragile, I thought your memory made you unfit." Her voice cracked. "But instead, you exposed me. You showed me that the real weakness is refusing to see the heart inside another person." The class listened, breathless. "I'm sorry for the way I treated you," she continued. "I judged you without knowing you. I used my voice to tear down someone I should have stood beside." She wiped her face again. "And I want you to know, I will never do that again. Not to you, not to anyone." Professor Alden's smile was soft, the kind that forgives before words even finish forming. "Mara," he said warmly, "you learned today what takes many people a lifetime to understand." He paused. "You learned what it means to be human." She sobbed harder. Then Alden turned his attention back to the entire room. "Before we end today's lesson," he said softly, "there is something more important than any curriculum I could teach." The students waited, still standing. He lifted a trembling hand and pointed gently to his heart. "The world will ask you to prove yourselves with achievements, awards, credentials, but your true worth will be shown in how you treat people, especially those who seem weak or slow or different or old." Silence deepened. "And when you meet someone who falters," Alden continued, "remember that the person in front of you carries invisible battles, invisible memories, invisible stories. Stories that may be the very reason they're still standing." Several students wiped their eyes. Mara covered her trembling mouth. Alden looked at her. "And if someone ever tests your memory, Mara, let your compassion answer before your pride." She nodded through tears. "Yes, sir." He smiled, that warm, wise smile that only a lifetime of caring can create. "But now," he said gently, "I believe it's time for me to dismiss you. I think I've taught enough for one day." Not a single student moved. They wanted to stay, to sit with him longer, to hold on to the moment, to hold on to him. Finally, the quiet student from the front row spoke, barely above a whisper. "Professor Alden, could we walk you to the faculty office?" Alden blinked, then nodded, touched beyond words. "I would like that very much." Mara stepped to his side immediately. "May I help you up?" He offered her his hand. "Thank you, Mara." Their fingers joined, past arrogance, past conflict, past judgment. The entire class formed around him like a gentle escort, their steps slow, respectful, almost ceremonial. They walked him through the doorway as though guiding a king, not out of duty, but out of love. Alden paused at the threshold and looked back one last time at the room where he had spent decades shaping lives. He whispered, as if speaking to the past itself, "I remember now." And as he stepped into the hallway, supported by the very students he had spent his life supporting, the class rose behind him with one final, powerful gesture. They placed their hands over their hearts, not for his memory, but for his legacy. A legacy Mara, and every student in that room, would carry for the rest of their lives. The day they stood not to challenge him, but to honor him. The day a radical heart learned compassion. The day an old teacher proved that true strength doesn't fade, it echoes.